The air in the attic was thick with dust and the silence of 3 decades. Sunlight, fractured by grime on the arched window, illuminated dancing motes of history. Elias Thorne, a man whose life had been spent cataloging the world's forgotten details, ran a gloved hand across a tarnished cedar chest. Elias was not an adventurer. He was an archivist. His world was paper, ink, and the quiet truth of what was. But the chest, found tucked behind a false wall in his late grandfather's century-old estate, was an anomaly. It smelled not of must and old lace, but of salt, sulfur, and a subtle metallic tang, like a coin left in the ocean for a century. The will had been explicit, the house, the land, and the quiet truth hidden behind the moon. Elias had dismissed the last part as a charming eccentricity of a dying man. Now, faced with a lock mechanism that was not a lock but a cryptic 6-pointed astronomical dial, he reconsidered. His grandfather, Arthur Thorne, had been a renowned, yet ultimately disgraced, naval cartographer. His career ended abruptly in 1953, not with a retirement party, but with a hushed inquiry and a complete erasure of his final, massive mapping project, which had focused on a tiny, uninhabited cluster of islands in the South Atlantic known only as the Vigil's Eye Archipelago. Arthur had retreated, spent the rest of his life tending a garden and refusing to speak of the sea, except to whisper, often to himself. The map tells a lie, but the lie protects the truth. Elias, a pragmatist to the core, had never believed in family secrets. He believed in documents. The chest, however, was stubbornly undocumented. Its dial resisted all standard codes, all obvious celestial alignments. Finally, driven by a frustration that bordered on obsession, Elias remembered a child's story his grandfather used to tell, a nonsense rhyme about the captain's hand and the hourglass sand. The rhyme spoke of a specific date, November 11th, the day Arthur's ship had been officially decommissioned. It wasn't a birthday, an anniversary, or any date of sentimental value. It was a date of official failure. With a slight trembling in his hands, Elias set the dial to the precise lunar phase of that night in 1953, according to a chart he'd found crumpled in Arthur's old desk. The mechanism clicked, not loudly, but with the heavy, definitive sound of history giving way. The lid groaned open. Inside, there was no gold, no jewelry, no wartime correspondence. There was only a single, perfectly preserved glass jar containing black, obsidian-like sand that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Next to it lay a folded, heavily weighted canvas map, and on top of both, a leather-bound journal titled simply, The Voyage of the Albatross, 1953. Elias lifted the journal. Its pages were not filled with nautical logs or sketches of coastlines. They were filled with elegant, dense handwriting, detailing not where the albatross had been, but what it had seen. The entry for November 10th, the day before the official disaster, read, "We have reached the coordinates. It is not an island, but a presence. It is a structure so ancient, it mocks the very concept of time. The men are afraid. They whisper about the silence of the compasses and the unnatural pull of the black sand we found near the site. Arthur is recording everything, knowing this journal will never reach London intact. We were sent to map a shoal. We have found the remnants of a forgotten god." Elias felt a cold dread that was not native to the dusty attic. His grandfather hadn't gone mad. He had gone silent to protect a secret too vast to comprehend. The map, when unrolled, was not a standard nautical chart. The lines were not depth soundings or currents. They were geometric patterns radiating from a single, impossible point labeled the Nexus. And the black sand in the jar, he noticed now, wasn't sand at all. Under the dim light, it seemed to subtly absorb the light, drawing it in. Elias, the skeptical archivist, was now holding the key to a 70-year-old governmental cover-up, and a possible encounter with something that defied geography and history. The final entry on the last page of the journal was a single, frantic sentence, underlined 3 times. "Tell no one about the light below the waves. Tell them we were lost. The map must be burned, but the sand must be scattered at the highest point. Only the sand knows the way back to the stillness." Back to the stillness. The phrase resonated with an unsettling power. Elias looked at the jar of black material, then at the incomprehensible map, and realized his quiet life had just been shattered. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that whoever had covered up his grandfather's voyage 70 years ago would be equally determined to keep the secret buried today. The past was not just history, it was a hungry shadow. He needed to know what the stillness was, and why his grandfather thought scattering this strange, dark substance was the key. He had a map to a place that shouldn't exist, and a journal that spoke of forgotten deities. The silence of the attic was now replaced by the deafening sound of an impending journey. He took a deep breath, the scent of sulfur and sea salt stinging his nostrils. He folded the map, tucked the journal under his arm, and slipped the jar of cold black sand into his pocket. The clock was ticking, not against the future, but against the moment the shadows of 1953 realized the secret was unearthed. The journey, he knew, would have to begin where Arthur's had ended. The isolated, forgotten Vigil's Eye Archipelago. The only problem? The Vigil's Eye Archipelago had been officially struck from all naval charts in 1954 and declared a non-existent navigational error. The man who archives the truth was now going hunting for a colossal lie. The final, terrifying question was not what his grandfather found, but what followed him home. Elias descended from the attic, the world feeling suddenly thin and fragile around him. The cedar chest, now empty of its secrets, seemed to mock him with its mundane appearance. He placed the map, the journal, and the jar of black material on his large mahogany desk, the usual domain of sensible ledgers and historical documents. He needed distance and detail. He spread the canvas map under the harsh beam of his archival lamp. It was drawn on linen canvas, resistant to water, but its ink bled at the edges, almost as if the lines themselves were trying to escape their confines. The map displayed a recognizable outline of the Vigil's Eye chain, 3 small, craggy volcanic remnants, but the rest was alien. The deep blue sea was overlaid with a matrix of red, angular lines that looked less like cartography and more like a circuit diagram for a monumental machine. The focal point, the Nexus, was located not on an island, but beneath a specific patch of water near the largest landmass, marked by an intricate, spiraling glyph that Elias recognized with a jolt. It was the same 6-pointed symbol that had adorned the chest lock. This wasn't a map showing the way to a place. It was a blueprint showing the way through one. The journal confirmed his suspicion. Arthur's entries meticulously detailed the disorientation they suffered upon approaching the coordinates. The compass spun like a drunken top. The radar painted an abyss. It was not the topography that confused us, but the physics, he had written. Elias spent the next 48 hours submerged in his grandfather's desperate legacy, feeding every term, every obscure coordinate, and every cryptic phrase into his vast network of specialized, often forgotten databases. The official cover story was ironclad. Albatross lost to an unexpected storm. Crew presumed lost at sea. No survivors. No wreckage found. Just a neat, sterile entry in the Admiralty records. The real truth lay in the omissions. His search for the Vigil's Eye Archipelago was a dead end in public records, but a deep dive into naval decommission logs of the 1950s yielded a brief, heavily redacted memo concerning an environmental quarantine implemented around the area, citing unstable magnetic fields. Unstable magnetic fields. That was the official lie designed to discourage inquisitive vessels. The real discovery the forgotten god, was protected by a bureaucratic wall of silence. The black substance in the jar, the purported sand, became Elias's main obsession. He transferred a microscopic sample to a slide. Under his high-powered microscope, he confirmed it wasn't silicon-based terrestrial sand. It was crystalline, incredibly dense, and possessed a uniform structured geometry that defied natural formation. It looked like tiny frozen shards of dark matter. When he carefully nudged one grain with a fine-point tungsten needle, the grain didn't move. Instead, the surrounding light dimmed, as if the speck had momentarily stolen the photons. The journal provided the only clue. Arthur called it stasis dust. It silences the machine of the world, one entry noted. Near the Nexus, a handful of this dust is enough to stop a ship's clock for days. This was the material his grandfather had insisted must be scattered at the highest point, a bizarre, almost sacrificial act. Elias was interrupted by a noise that didn't belong in his quiet, secured brownstone. A faint click by the front door. The sound of a lock being professionally picked. Not a burglar, but someone meticulous and trained. He grabbed the heavy brass paperweight, a replica of a salvaged ship's propeller, and held his breath. He had been so focused on the secrets of the past that he had forgotten the danger of the present. He heard soft, measured footsteps ascending the stairs. Whoever this was, they knew how to move silently and purposefully. They weren't looking for silver. They were looking for a secret. Elias quickly scanned his desk. The journal and map were too big to hide quickly. The jar of stasis dust, the key to the entire mystery, was small enough. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, just as a tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark suit reached the landing. The man wasn't armed, or at least he didn't show it, but his eyes, cold and steel gray, held the dangerous competence of a lifetime spent in espionage. "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked, his voice smooth and devoid of inflection, like polished slate. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Mr. Sterling. I represent a private acquisitions firm. We have been tasked with the retrieval of certain familial property that was, shall we say, misplaced." Elias's pulse hammered. "My grandfather's will left everything to me." Sterling offered a tight, professional smile. "Indeed. But some items belong to a different legacy, Mr. Thorne. Items that carry a certain, shall we say, instability. We are particularly interested in the contents of the cedar chest. The canvas chart and the journal would suffice." He didn't ask if Elias had found them. He simply demanded them, with the easy authority of someone who always got what he wanted. Elias pointedly picked up the brass propeller. "I am an archivist, Mr. Sterling. I don't misplace history, and I don't negotiate with trespassers." Sterling's eyes flickered briefly to the location where the chest had been, then landed on Elias's jacket pocket, a subtle bulge that Sterling's practiced eye missed nothing. He had found something. "We can do this easily, Mr. Thorne. Or we can do this, difficultly. This secret is not yours to hold. It is a matter of global equilibrium. The events of 1953 were contained for a reason. Do not force us to prove that the containment is still active." The threat hung in the air, the implication that the same dark hand that erased his grandfather's life could erase his own. Elias realized the cover-up wasn't history. It was a live predatory entity. He saw his chance. Sterling was focused on the map and the journal. He grabbed both, threw them across the room, and as Sterling instinctively lunged to save the documents, Elias burst out of his study, down the stairs, and out the back door, leaving the impeccably dressed operative cursing softly in the sudden, shattering silence. He ran, clutching the cold, dark jar in his pocket. He was no adventurer, but his grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. The map must be burned, but the sand must be scattered. He had the sand, the key, and he knew, with chilling clarity, that Sterling and his private acquisitions firm would be following closely. The only safe place to go was the most dangerous place on the map, the Vigil's Eye. His archival research was over. The voyage had begun, with a relentless shadow chasing him. He needed a boat, a destination that didn't exist, and a way to scatter stasis dust at the center of a 70-year-old mystery. Elias's frantic escape was clumsy, adrenaline-fueled, and entirely uncharacteristic of a man who usually moved between the library and his study. He ditched his car miles away, using a labyrinthine network of public transport and back alleys to shake any immediate surveillance. He knew Sterling wouldn't be deterred. A man who operates with that level of quiet confidence possesses limitless resources and unwavering patience. His priority was clear: get to the sea, get a vessel, and disappear into the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean before the net tightened around him. He couldn't trust banks, airports, or standard channels of travel. He was an archivist turned fugitive, operating on a map of lies and a pocket full of frozen darkness. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to find the only person who might understand the peculiar urgency of his situation: Marina Karras. Marina was a marine salvage expert and an unconventional historian who specialized in lost histories, stories too strange or sensitive for official record. She owed Elias a favor, a significant one, from when he had helped her authenticate a disputed piece of evidence concerning a lost World War II U-boat. More importantly, she operated out of a small, discreet port in Maine, running a tightly knit, cash-only operation. She dealt in the undocumented, the forgotten, and the impossible. Elias reached her facility near dawn, a grimy, windswept shipyard that smelled heavily of diesel and brine. Marina, a woman with sun-weathered hands and eyes that missed nothing, listened to his breathless account, her expression moving from skepticism to guarded concern. She examined the map, running her thumb over the complex, alien geometry near the Nexus. "This isn't just hydrography, Elias," she observed, her voice low. "It's structured mathematics. The angular lines, they suggest a field, a constant, defined energy source." She recognized the gravity of the situation immediately upon seeing the single, underlined sentence in Arthur's journal about the light below the waves. "Your grandfather didn't find a lost civilization. He found a power source, something that was either intentionally hidden or never meant to be found." When Elias finally showed her the jar of stasis dust, Marina grew utterly silent. She didn't touch it, but simply stared, fascinated and fearful. "This is what they want back, isn't it?" she asked. "This material. It's not a relic. It's a tool. Arthur didn't just stumble upon something. He took the key to lock it up." After a long, tense negotiation and the promise of a significant share in whatever history lay dormant, Marina agreed to take him. She had a fast, heavily modified research vessel, the Triton, a boat capable of withstanding rough South Atlantic currents and, more importantly, a vessel equipped with specialized non-magnetic navigation systems, a crucial detail given Arthur's warnings about spinning compasses. They set sail quickly, under the pretense of a deep-sea cable repair job in the mid-Atlantic. The Triton cut through the waves, a small, desperate arrowhead aimed at a phantom location. Elias spent the initial days of the voyage studying the stasis dust. He was still the archivist, relying on observation and controlled experiment. He found that the material was inert until exposed to a specific, oscillating low-frequency energy. He discovered this by accident when he placed the jar near the boat's aging shortwave radio, which had been buzzing with static. The dust in the jar seemed to momentarily quiver, and the static cut out instantly, leaving a profound, unnatural silence in the speaker. He realized the dust didn't just absorb light. It dampened energy. Electromagnetic energy, kinetic energy, perhaps even the energy of sound. This was the key to the stillness. It wasn't a place of quiet contemplation. It was a place where energy itself was suppressed. On the 5th day out, well into the open ocean, the first shadow of Sterling's pursuit appeared on the horizon. A sleek, fast, gray motor yacht, impossibly quick for a civilian vessel, closed the gap. Marina spotted it first, her binoculars fixed on the distant hull. "They're not waiting, Elias. They're coming straight for us. Too fast to be a coincidence. They must have attached a tracker to the Triton before we left port." Panic, raw and paralyzing, flared in Elias. They were defenseless. The Triton was a research vessel, not a warship. Sterling's private acquisitions firm was clearly a front for something far more equipped and ruthless. "The map must be burned, but the sand must be scattered at the highest point," Arthur's final warning repeated in his mind. But they weren't at the highest point yet. He had to use the dust to buy time. A desperate, terrifying idea formed. "The engine room, Marina. Can you give me 15 minutes of maximum output? I need the most powerful concentration of low-frequency energy you can generate." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. "Are you going to try and stop their engines?" "No," Elias said, pulling the jar of stasis dust from his pocket. "I'm going to stop time for them." He rushed to the engine room, a cramped, deafening space filled with the rhythmic pounding of the Triton's twin diesels. He opened the jar of stasis dust, the cold, black grains resting unnaturally still in his palm. The noise of the engines was almost unbearable. He held the dust near a powerful, exposed section of the generator and, with a shaking hand, flicked a tiny pinch of the stasis dust into the air. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The metallic clang of the engine didn't stop. It froze. Not the engine itself, but the sound and the vibration. The air around the area where the dust landed became heavy, silent, and distorted, like looking through thick, hot glass. It was an island of unnerving stillness in the midst of mechanical chaos. The dust was consuming the energy in the vicinity. He knew he couldn't stop the yacht entirely, but he could create a localized, paralyzing effect. He moved back to the deck and, bracing himself against the rail, he carefully threw a small handful of the dust toward the rapidly approaching gray vessel. The wind carried the cold, dark particles across the water. On the distant yacht, as the stasis dust settled over its antennae and primary engine vents, an impossible thing happened. The yacht didn't slow. It appeared to snag on something invisible. The running lights flickered and died. The roar of its powerful engines, which they could now distinctly hear, abruptly cut off, replaced by an eerie, total silence across the water. The vessel now floated dead in the water, a ghost ship suddenly imprisoned in a bubble of localized physics. They had maybe an hour, perhaps less, before the yacht's crew could manually override the paralysis. Elias had just used a fragment of a lost god's technology to stop his pursuers. He was no longer an archivist. He was now a guardian of the impossible, and he had just irrevocably escalated the conflict. He looked at the almost empty jar in his hand. The true mystery wasn't what the dust was, but how a handful of it could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality, and what that said about the source from which it came, the Nexus at Vigil's Eye. He turned to Marina. "Set a new course. Maximum speed. Full blackout. We need to reach the coordinates before that silence breaks." The journey to the Vigil's Eye archipelago was a tense, silent sprint against the breaking of the stasis dust's fragile, localized paralysis. Marina pushed the Triton to its limits, navigating by a combination of encrypted satellite data and the increasingly strange, angular geometry of Arthur's map. As they approached the designated coordinates, the air itself seemed to change. The usual white noise of the ocean, the slap of the waves, the cry of gulls, the deep resonance of the hull, began to feel muffled, as if they were sinking into a pool of thick, viscous water. The Triton's onboard electronics, though modified to be non-magnetic, started to register subtle, erratic fluctuations. The digital clock on the bridge, a minor low-frequency device, began to lag, losing seconds at random intervals, a ghostly echo of the Stasis Dust's power. "We're close," Marina muttered, her knuckles white on the helm. "We're entering the field of influence. This is where Arthur's crew lost their minds." The Vigil's eye finally materialized out of the thick sea fog. 3 jagged volcanic peaks, black and inhospitable, utterly devoid of life. They were exactly as described in the redacted memos, a navigational nightmare. Elias compared the site to the map. The islands were mere anchor points for the true location, the Nexus, an impossible point marked deep underwater. They anchored the Triton in a small, sheltered cove on the largest island, which Arthur's journal had referred to as the Sentinel. The silence on land was profound and unnerving. It was not the peaceful quiet of a remote place. It was an absence of sound. There were no insect chirps, no breeze rustling the sparse, scrubby vegetation. And even their footsteps on the black, igneous rock seemed to dissipate instantly, as if the air were swallowing the energy of their movement. This was the Stillness, the place where the laws of sound and motion were perpetually attenuated. Elias, clutching the remaining jar of stasis dust, led the way, guided by the topographical notes and strange cryptic symbols in his grandfather's journal. Arthur's final, frantic entry demanded the scattering of the dust at the highest point. This point, according to the journal's sketches, was not the summit of the peak, but a specific, naturally occurring obsidian spire, shaped like an impossible, tapering needle, located on a treacherous ridge overlooking the cove. As they climbed, they made their first tangible discovery. Tucked into a narrow, smoke-blackened crevice, Elias found a discarded, rusting metal plate. It was not from the Albatross. The metal bore the distinct stamp of a different military vessel, a research submarine that had officially been lost in the region 10 years after Arthur's doomed voyage. It was a clear sign that Sterling's organization, or another like it, had attempted to access the Nexus before and had failed or been contained. The secret was deeper and more active than a 70-year-old cover-up. It was a persistent, ongoing operation. They finally reached the obsidian spire. It stood maybe 30 feet high, perfectly smooth, and unnaturally warm to the touch. The air around it shimmered slightly. At its base, a small, square depression was carved into the rock, almost like a perfect socket. Beside it, lying on the ground, was a single disturbing artifact. An antique ship's clock, its brass casing heavily pitted by sea salt, but its face frozen. The hands pointed perpetually to 11:04 p.m., November 10th, 1953, the exact moment Arthur's journal entry shifted from professional log to terrified personal testimony. And inside the clock's glass face, Elias saw tiny, black specks, residual stasis dust, trapped inside the mechanism, freezing the movement of time within its delicate gears. His grandfather had attempted his act of sacrifice here. He had scattered his first, desperate batch of stasis dust, trying to silence the machine and protect the secret by stopping time, or at least the information flow, around the Nexus. Elias carefully placed the jar into the socket at the base of the spire. It fit perfectly like a key into a lock. As the glass touched the obsidian, a low, resonant hum pulsed through the rock, not audible through the ears but felt in the chest. Then, the black dust in the jar began to vibrate violently, the particles blurring into a dark cloud inside the glass. The shimmering air around the spire intensified, and the angular red lines of Arthur's map, the ones representing the physics, suddenly seemed to project themselves into Elias's mind's eye. He saw a brief, instantaneous flash, a geometric grid, deep underwater, pulsing with a blinding, impossible blue light. The stillness wasn't just silence, it was a frequency, a field of influence powered by the light below the waves. And the stasis dust was the tuning fork, the key to accessing that frequency. But the light wasn't the only thing that activated. The hum subsided, and a new sound broke the unnerving stillness, the distinct, heavy thump-thump of a rotor blade approaching fast. Sterling was here. He had broken free of the paralysis field, and he was coming directly to the only activated spot on the island. Elias and Marina were trapped on the treacherous ridge, exposed. They had activated the mechanism, whatever it was, and now the protectors were coming. Elias snatched the now empty jar from the socket. The stasis dust had vanished, absorbed by the spire. The obsidian spire was vibrating violently, and from the rock, a single, new object slowly extruded itself, rising like a dark flower. A small, intricately carved wooden box, clearly marine salvage, covered in barnacles and bearing the same six-pointed astronomical dial as the cedar chest. Arthur hadn't tried to stop the place. He had tried to communicate with it, and this box was the reply. Elias didn't have time to open it. He grabbed Marina, shoving the box into her hand. "The boat now! They're coming for the key!" The helicopter, black and silent in the unnatural dimness, crested the peak, its spotlight blinding. The voice that came over its loudspeaker was Sterling's, calm and utterly ruthless. "Mr. Thorne, you have activated the failsafe. You have the box. Drop it. You are out of time." The final, terrifying confrontation was upon them, high above the treacherous waters that hid the Nexus and its impossible blinding blue light. The helicopter's downwash buffeted Elias and Marina, spraying them with fine, salty mist and stinging grit. Sterling hadn't just pursued them. He had cornered them. Elias pushed Marina toward the treacherous downward path, shouting over the roar of the rotor blades. "Go, get to the Triton, find out what the box is." Marina didn't argue, her survival instincts overriding her curiosity. She clutched the barnacle-encrusted wooden box and began her descent. Elias, meanwhile, turned to face the threat, holding nothing but the empty jar that had once held the stasis dust, a defiant, empty symbol. Sterling rappelled down from the helicopter himself, a figure of icy precision even in this chaotic environment. He was flanked by two armed, silent figures in tactical gear, his acquisitions firm revealing its true paramilitary nature. Sterling's expression was one of cold, professional disappointment. "A foolish move, Mr. Thorne. You've risked global stability for a 70-year-old ghost story." "The Nexus is not a historical curiosity. It is a damper. Your grandfather found it, and we, his silent successors, have maintained its silence." Elias stood his ground near the spire, feeling the persistent, low-level hum of the activated site radiating through the rock. "My grandfather called it the stillness. What is it stilling, Sterling? What is this dampening?" Sterling took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register, forcing Elias to strain to hear over the helicopter's engine. "It is dampening the frequency. The Nexus is a naturally occurring, pre-human structure. Not a god, Mr. Thorne, but a colossal, resonant antenna. It radiates a signal, a deep, pervasive frequency that affects certain biological and chemical processes. In short, it causes uncontrollable instability, warped thought, chaotic decay. In 1953, your grandfather's crew was not lost in a storm. They succumbed to the Nexus's unfiltered influence. They tore each other apart before the albatross even sank." Elias felt a terrifying chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The stillness was a global defense mechanism. And the stasis dust? The stasis dust, or what we call Nexus sediment, is the byproduct of the damper's operation. It's concentrated stillness, scattering it at the apex. That was your grandfather's last, desperate attempt to recharge the ancient mechanism, to force it back online. He failed, but you, Elias, have succeeded. Sterling signaled his armed men, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. The box, Mr. Thorne. Hand it over. It is the control matrix, the manual override. The key. You have just caused the Nexus to eject. At that moment, a muffled shout echoed up from below. Marina, having reached the relative safety of the Triton's deck, had managed to open the wooden box. The six-pointed dial had yielded not to a code, but to the latent frequency left by the stasis dust being pressed against the spire. Elias saw a flash of light from the boat, followed by a sound that cut through the engine noise. A strange, discordant, high-pitched whine. The contents of the box were not a log or a button. They were a single, highly polished metallic object shaped like a tuning fork, which Marina had instinctively touched to the Triton's still fluctuating radio receiver. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The tuning fork was not a switch. It was a transmitter. It began to broadcast the undampened frequency of the Nexus. The helicopter directly above them suddenly pitched violently. The rotor blades didn't seize. They simply began to spin out of sync, vibrating so violently that the entire chassis groaned and shuddered. The two armed men dropped their weapons, clutching their heads, screaming not from pain, but from sheer auditory and neurological dissonance. The Nexus's unfiltered signal was flooding the air, shattering the stability of nearby complex systems. Sterling, shielded by some kind of advanced ear protection, looked up in horror. "She's broadcasting! That fool has activated the full broadcast!" Elias seized the opportunity. The broadcast was paralyzing Sterling's resources, but it was also affecting him. His head throbbed, and the world seemed to warp at the edges, the geometric lines from Arthur's map appearing in his vision. He used the last of his strength, grabbing a fist-sized piece of jagged obsidian rock, and lunged at Sterling, striking his shoulder hard enough to knock him off balance. Sterling stumbled, dropping his sophisticated radio receiver, which immediately began to emit a screeching, destructive feedback loop. "You need to stop the broadcast, Elias. You have no idea what that frequency will do in open air. It destroys equilibrium," Sterling yelled, desperate now. "The Nexus protects the world from itself." Elias looked down at the Triton. Marina, visibly struggling under the noise and the distortion, was wrestling with the wooden box, trying to turn the signal off. He realized the horrifying truth. The Nexus wasn't a hidden treasure or a weapon. It was an incredibly ancient, natural cosmic filter. Arthur's journal wasn't about finding a treasure. It was about protecting humanity from a primal, resonant instability. The stasis dust was the concentrated silence used to maintain that filter. Elias saw his final purpose. He had to stop the open-air transmission. He scrambled down the side of the spire, ignoring the nausea and the mind-shattering frequency. He reached the bottom, where Sterling was trying to recover. He tackled Sterling, managing to rip the man's ear protection free, just as they tumbled over the ridge. They fell only a few feet, landing hard. Sterling's head was immediately assaulted by the full, terrifying whine of the Nexus signal. He gasped, his eyes wide with a combination of agony and the sudden, chaotic lucidity of the undamped frequency. "The map!" he screamed, not in pain, but in realization. "The geometry! It's the key to the frequency. It's the countersignal!" Elias, gripping his grandfather's linen map tightly, realized his grandfather hadn't told him to burn the map to hide the secret. He had told him to burn it, to destroy the counter key. He saw Marina below, still struggling with the tuning fork. Elias pulled out a cigarette lighter he'd forgotten he possessed. He looked at Sterling, now writhing and incoherent on the rocks, a victim of the very force he sought to control. Elias made his choice. He did not go for the key. He went for the signal's inhibitor. He held the map out, exposing the complex, anti-chaotic red lines to the wind. He ignited the bottom corner. The linen caught quickly. As the geometric lines, the complex mathematics of anti-resonance, were consumed by fire, the effect was immediate and absolute. The piercing, chaotic whine of the Nexus signal collapsed. The sound didn't fade. It went instantly, violently silent. The helicopter, momentarily free of the dissonance, lurched back into controlled flight. The armed men on the rocks below stopped screaming, only to find their memories fractured and their focus gone. Elias watched the last of the map curl into ash, and the oppressive, unnatural stillness of the island returned, stronger than before, like a vast, silent hand had pressed down on the physics of the world. He had silenced the broadcast, but he had destroyed the only known blueprint for understanding the Nexus. The mystery was now safe, not because it was contained, but because it was irretrievable. Finalna Chestina, the final part. The final part. The silence that followed the incineration of Arthur's map was heavier than any sound. The helicopter, piloted by a disoriented crew, quickly retreated, leaving Sterling behind, now sitting vacant-eyed on the rocks, physically intact but mentally shattered by the abrupt collapse of the frequency. Elias looked down at the ashes of the map and realized that his grandfather's wisdom was the ultimate truth. The lie of the lost storm protected humanity not from an enemy, but from a revelation too fundamental to bear. The map was the only thing that made the chaos coherent. Its destruction ensured the secret would never be fully understood or weaponized. Marina, recovering quickly, rushed back to Elias. The tuning fork, now inert, sat inside the wooden box. It was a tool of revelation, not destruction, and now it was useless without the mathematical map to guide its signal. They were left with two remnants: the empty jar, a vessel of forgotten stillness, and the wooden box, a silent, beautiful lock. They did not take Sterling. They left him as a casualty of the very thing he swore to protect, a final, horrifying warning. The journey back was made in a contemplative, profound quiet. They left the Vigil's Eye archipelago exactly as they found it, an empty, non-existent place on the official charts, now guarded by an even deeper, more powerful silence. Elias returned to his life, but he was no longer an archivist of dusty paper. He was the archivist of a great, necessary silence. He had traded his comfortable certainty for an uncomfortable truth, that some secrets must remain buried, not to protect the powerful, but to protect the fragile, delicate equilibrium of the human mind and the world it inhabits. He never spoke of the Nexus or the Stasis Dust, or the man named Sterling. He scattered the final ashes of the map into the Gulf Stream currents, ensuring the geometry was gone forever. He kept only the wooden box, placing it back in the cedar chest, the new lock to the silent, true history of the world. He understood that Arthur Thorne hadn't been disgraced. He had been the first archivist of the Stillness, a sentinel against chaos. Elias now sat in his study, the familiar scent of old paper grounding him in the quiet reality he had fought to protect. He looked at the six-pointed symbol on the chest. He knew that the world he catalogued was only half the truth. The other half was vast, silent, and protected by a lie. His story was over, but the stillness remained. The question for the audience, the true, enduring mystery, was not what Elias had found, but what cosmic instability the Nexus was still silencing at that very moment, unseen and unknown, beneath the deepest waves. The silence was the ultimate story,